Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to our current SAMI session called Overcoming Customer Indecision, the JOLT Effect. For those of you who aren't familiar with SAMI, we tend to focus on some cutting edge and timely programming. And today is going to be a real good example of that. Before we jumped on the call, I was talking to some folks about a television show I've been watching called The Bear. It takes place in our speaker's hometown of Chicago. And I was relating the bear to being a sales leader and reading the Jolt Effect book, and it made me very uncomfortable. And I was trying to understand why. So, for those of us who've led sales teams, let's think about it. You work with your team, your BDRs, your direct salespeople, and the funnel looks great. And at the bottom of the funnel, all of a sudden we have closed loss. The customer didn't do anything, or the bottom of the funnel is really, really fat. And maybe I'm feeling guilty and uncomfortable like the beer because sometimes as a sales leader, we tend to be not necessarily nice to get those deals over the line. And I was feeling guilty about that. And when I read Ted's book, it's like, oh my God, I'm going to have to go and get forgiveness from everybody I've yelled at over the years to get these deals done because Ted's hitting a topic that's really odd. So I think for a lot of us who've been sales leaders, we get exposed to spin selling years ago, and we tweaked the team and we tweaked our selling techniques. Then we had Matt Dixon, who's the collaborator with Ted on the Challenger sale. We adopted that. But still, even as we adapt, the market tends to adapt with us. And all of a sudden, the clouds come in again. So back in early last year, I came across the Jolt Effect. And it was like, oh my goodness, I felt like somebody opened up a new door. We had been missing everything. This is an extremely timely, concept and topic. Ted's work on this is absolutely fantastic. So if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, and Ted, your goal today is to make us feel better, especially those of us with this residual guilt, that would be great. And so I oftentimes thought that is customer indecision the kryptonite to our Superman sellers and Superwoman sellers, and Ted's going to work with us to get through that. So a little bit about Ted. He's a co-author of the Jolt Effect, obviously. He's also the founding partner of DCM Insights. He's an accomplished sales and customer experience researcher whose work has appeared in great publications such as Harvard Business Review. And he's a sought-after speaker, and we're lucky to have him today. Great. Prior to co-founding DCM, Ted held numerous executive positions in product strategy and research, and done a lot of research, and was also involved with CEB, which is now part of Gartner. So, like every SAMI session, you can put your questions in the chat. Feel free to interrupt. We'll have a lot of questions at the end too, but these sessions tend to be very, 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 very lively. So let's chime in, and Ted, the challenge for you is we've got a heck of a topic here. Help us feel better. So Ted, I am turning it over to you.
Well, thank you. I didn't know it was my job to make you feel better, so I'll have to maybe adjust the agenda here. Well, thanks for having me all. I'm excited to share with you a little bit about Jolt Effect. Some of you may know it a little bit. Some of you might be brand new to it. I'll try to just give, I think, about 15 minutes overview of the study and what we found about what high performers do differently in these moments. And then I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and any discussion. Let me pull up my slides here and just confirm you guys can see them okay here.
Perfectly, Ted.
Yep. Looking good. Okay, great. Yeah, and to Pam and Rob's point, let's try to make this as interactive as possible. I guess keep me on my toes. Maybe that's part of it. I'll make you guys feel better, and you guys make me feel less comfortable. Just keep me on my toes as much as I can. So let me tell you a little bit about the Jolt Effect. I always like to start from sort of a personal perspective here, particularly with respect to indecision, because this is something I think all of us can kind of identify with. And unfortunately, even though Matt and I have been studying indecision for like 3 years, big, huge study we did of 2.5 million sales conversations. We spoke to hundreds and hundreds of salespeople and sales leaders. We looked at decades worth of psychology and behavioral economics to understand, why was this happening to people, and how did they make decisions? And I would hope that by then I would have been immune to indecision, but unfortunately, I still myself have to deal with it more frequently than I'd like to admit. My most recent example is the Remarkable tablet. I don't know if you guys have seen those ads. It's like a iPad equivalent where you have to write, it's like writing on paper, so they say. And the marketing team, they must hate me, or maybe they love me. I'm not sure, because I click on all those ads because I'm like, I'm going to be so focused. I'm going to take these great notes. It just looks so fantastic. And then I open it up, I look at it, and I think, I'm not going to actually use this. I'm going to sit and collect dust. And my kids really need another excuse to make fun of me about some piece of technology. Like, I think I'm not. So I open them all up and I close them all down. And that's the most recent, but not the only example of indecision that I grapple with. Now, what Matt and I set out to find was, though, in a B2B context, when buyers are spending other people's money, does this affect them in the same way it affects all of us when we go to buy things? And then more importantly, what's the effect on sales teams and sellers as they deal with and help their buyers overcome this level of indecision? Now, one of the first things we found was that indecision is a really big problem that we have to get after and fix. And I think we all knew that in our gut, that indecision in and of itself was a big problem for our buyers, but we've now sized it in a way that helps us to understand the scale of it. So in our research, we found roughly 40 to 60% of all deals are lost to no decision. So sure, we can lose to a named competitor, but what we found is anywhere between 40 and 60% of deals are lost to a buyer deciding to do nothing at all. And that will range a little bit based on who you're selling to and where you're selling and how complex that decision might be. Candidly, we found this maybe 18 months ago or so. And I think there are some markets that wish that they were 40 to 60% now. It's closer to 60, 70, 80%. But nonetheless, a very big problem, because if you think about the dead weight loss this represents for sales organizations, this is quite damaging, because these are buyers who run the full process with us and consume all sorts of resources and time and require demo after demo, and sales engineers and solutions engineers, all these people that help them to try to get to this point, only for them to decide to do nothing at all. So a huge problem in general for all of us to grapple with. That's the bad news, is that this is a big problem. The good news is it is solvable. So that's what we found in our study, is that there are certain people, certain types of high performers that were able to succeed in this environment, who were actually able to get through past that indecision. In the study, we found that the average win rate was about 26% for most sellers in the study. But you can see, as on the right-hand side of the slide, high performers were quite different, more than double their performance of their peers. And it wasn't just that they performed better, because of course that's always going to be true of high performers. It was specifically where they were overperforming, and the biggest difference maker in the study, which was what we'll call cold feet moments. So these are the places where it feels like the buyer's tracking along, everything seems to be going well. Everyone's kind of vibing. They're flying through the pipeline. They maybe have even expressed intent to purchase. So I'm going to do something. I want to do something. I feel like I need to do something. I might have even won selection. Like, if they buy from anyone, they're going to buy from us. But then they start to backtrack. They start to hem and haw. They start to ask questions about things you thought were put to bed months ago, and they just start to go cold. And what we found is that high performers handled those moments, those cold feet moments, quite differently than their peers. And that's kind of where the study takes off, is unpacking both sides of this story. The 59%, right? The high performer, that is the JOLT playbook. How do we all, as sellers, replicate what's happening here on the right side of the page? But there's also a part of the story that's about the 26%, about the pitfalls we need to look out for and the traps that we need to avoid. And I want to start there, because I think it is instructive, to Rob's point about some of the things we've all been trained and taught about how to engage buyers. So if you think about a decision process in kind of three acts, you take a buyer from the left to the right on the slide. Every seller of the world has to do this for every buyer, right? We've got to get them from their status quo. That's what they're doing today. We get them to believe that a new vision is necessary. It's necessary, it's urgent, it's worth spending money on. Change is hard and change is kind of annoying. So in general, people would prefer not to do that. They prefer their status quo. So I have to get them from their status quo to agree on a superior vision. But then, of course, I got to get them to believe that that concept is worth transacting on too. So I've got to get through terms and conditions and all sorts of things. So that's kind of the three different acts that we all take buyers through. Sometimes, of course, it's rather easy to get the buyer to believe that change is necessary. Maybe it's a former customer that has switched jobs and they're just inclined to purchase from you because they had a good experience. Maybe they just fly through the process because they love the demo and they're willing to move forward quickly. And then sometimes it's a little harder to get them to believe that change is necessary, that it's worth doing now, that I'm going to go and build consensus around it. But irrespective of how hard it is to get from that left box to the middle box, what we find, of course, is that there's tons of things that can still happen and can still go take that deal off the rails. Terms have to be considered, conditions have to be weighed, procurement might get involved, legal might get involved. Lots of things happen between this second box and this third box, right? That's why we have this very ominous exclamation point here, pointing out that deals often get stuck in this place. And we all know this, right? The question is, what do most of us do in this moment where it feels like things are tracking along well, buyer seems excited, and then all of a sudden they start to go cold and they start to kind of backtrack and it feels like things are falling off the rails. Well, what we found, and I think what most of us do, in fact, in our study, 73% of sellers, is that we interpret this as a problem of persuasion and motivation. They must not want it enough. They're saying they do, but they must not want it enough, because if they did want it enough, if they really truly wanted it enough, then surely these terms and these conditions ought not be that big of an obstacle. Surely we should be able to push past this and they would be booking time on our calendar, excited about the purchase. They must not want it enough. And so we go back to the well and we relitigate that case against the status quo. We relitigate the case of change, and it kind of comes in a couple different flavors, but all of them can be captured by what we'll call the FOMO appeal. We're trying to
Yeah. Hey,
appeal to.
Ted, can I ask you a question on
Sure.
this? And you may get to you may get to this later on, and you covered it in the book, which I thought was pretty important. But when we look at our sales teams, and oftentimes when I'm training a new sales team, the emphasis is on recognizing things early and getting it off the pipe early. Are there any early indicators that the actual potential, that the prospect has indecision issues? Because all of a sudden we can invest months, even longer, before we get down to your little warning sign here. Did you guys find anything that gives an early indication?
Yeah. Well, I think we will cover this a little bit. The first most important lesson is we can't just assume that indecision is a late stage problem, because by the time you wait until they might explicitly say things that make you think they might be indecisive, it might be too late. You could start detecting indecision from the very first conversation with the buyer, and it can co-occur with some of the things they might be grappling with around the status quo, which is really more about us as sellers overcoming indifference. That's kind of our first challenge, is we have to overcome their indifference to us as a supplier or to the problem that we're proposing. That's different than indecision. And yeah, you can start detecting both rather early. And of course, they're going to sound quite different.
Thanks.
And I think, we'll get into for those of you that know the story, the J part of the story, the judge level of indecision very much is about qualifying, disqualifying, understanding the level of indecision, such that, if they can never come to a decision, even if they're a great fit, I might need to walk away. And so I need to be listening for that from the very first, from the word go. So the three ways in which we try to relitigate this status quo argument is again, all of them are about kind of telling the buyer they're going to miss out. They're going to miss out either by miss out on solving the big problem that we've talked about, or miss out because their competitors are going to outpace them. And it comes in a couple different flavors. Some of them are like a carrot, where I'm painting this big rosy picture about the ROI and the reason why this investment is so worthwhile. I could also use the stick, where I paint a very dark picture about all the bad things that will happen if you don't go down this path. And if those two things don't work, then of course all of us have that handy dandy 10% discount that we break out in this moment. Try to get that decision through in that moment. So those are kind of the three traditional plays that most of us use in this moment. And what we were trying to figure out was, does that work for this buyer, where it feels like things are tracking along and things then get cold? And what we found in pretty dramatic fashion was the answer is no. So it backfires. In fact, 84% of the time, it makes things worse, not better. You're better off doing nothing at all. You actually make it more likely they make no decision at all. So pretty frustrating moment, I think, for a lot of sellers because it feels like I've run every play that I know. I've used every tool imaginable. Like, why don't they get it? Why don't they understand how great we are? Why don't they understand? And it's not what high performers have kind of figured out is it's not so much about the fact that they don't get that change is necessary or that they don't want that change. In fact, they do. And it's almost kind of a painful thing for that buyer because they can see the need, they see the problem, and yet they still can't really kind of get to the point where they're moving forward. And so what high performers figured out is that's actually the wrong question to be asking. It's the wrong question to be asking about, why won't this buyer change? The better question is, why would anyone go through this entire process? Consume months of time and resources, take up on our side, on their side, and only to then decide to do nothing at all. Why would anyone do that? And when we asked it like that, we found is something pretty interesting because it turns out there's two reasons that decisions end in no decision. So yes, on the bottom left-hand side, their preference for their status quo, what they're doing today, absolutely has been and remains a big reason why buyers will decide to do nothing, right? But it's not the only reason. They also will end in no decision because of indecision due to fear of failure. We saw all these instances in our study where the seller was doing all the things you would hope. They were persuading, they were challenging, they were doing all the things you would want with respect to trying to drive urgency and build this burning platform from change. And the buyer seemed quite excited. They were intending to purchase. They felt like things were going along pretty well, and yet still things were ending in no decision. And it wasn't just that there was this second reason, right? And I want to be clear, like, of course, if you have not yet overcome their preference for status quo, you're not going to sell anything. You have to be able to do that, right? But it's not the only problem. And it wasn't just that there was this second problem that we didn't fully understand. It also turned out to be the bigger of the two. So 56% of no decision was due to this indecision due to fear of failure versus that preference for status quo.
Hey, Ted, the question here is, and this is a critically important slide. Has this always been the case? And did your research show that these ratios? First of all, there's the overall no decision ratio just in general, but did your research show anything that over time, indecision's becoming worse? It's the same, and the insight there.
Yeah. So look, I think indecision has always been a thing. I think it was easier for us to spot with the method we used in our study around machine learning and AI because you're able to study it at scale and get to implicit mentions from buyers in this respect. But I do think that there's a lot of evidence that indecision in general is on a secular rise for reasons that we'll get to in a moment in terms of what are the biggest drivers of indecision. There are factors, some of which we might be able to blame ourselves for actually as suppliers, but many of which are just facts of life that buyers are dealing with that actually is driving indecision to be a bigger problem now versus 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Thank you.
This was the point in the study when we sort of turned to psychology and behavioral economics to try to understand why might this be happening? What's driving these buyers to end in this indecision due to fear of failure? So bring a couple gentlemen into the conversation. You guys might know Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, famous psychologists and behavioral economists, Nobel Prize winning. Kahneman wrote that great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and they're most famous for prospect theory or loss aversion. You guys probably are familiar with those terms, but even if you're not, you're pretty familiar in general with the principle of it, because that's why all of us use that FOMO appeal, that fear of missing out, because we're trying to appeal to the fact that humans in general are just wired to want to avoid loss. We care more about avoiding loss than we do about the upside gain of the potential win. This is why, like the championship, well, you guys are most of you in Boston. So, like, Belichick can't sleep at night, even though he's got like 7 Super Bowls, but he lost the game last week, right? We're just wired to want to avoid loss. But there's a wrinkle in the research that's really important for us to understand with respect to how buyers make decisions and how indecision grips our buyers. Because what they found is there's 2 types of losses that people really worry about. The first one is an error of omission, and the second one is an error of commission. So an error of omission is I did not do something, and as a consequence, I missed out. Right? I didn't do something and I missed out. So imagine a couple of years ago, for example, your friend invested in crypto and you didn't, and now they have a private island in the Caribbean and you're super jealous about it because you didn't actually invest. You might feel better about that decision now. I'm not sure. I'll have to check the crypto markets. But you get the point, right? I didn't do something, and as a consequence, I missed out. Error of commission is I did do something, it went horribly wrong, and I got blamed. Right? I did do something, it went horribly wrong, and I got blamed, and it's a very personal form of loss. And so what they found is actually the error of commission actually is a bigger thing. It weighs heavier on us as individuals. And so what that means for us in sales is that FOMO appeal, that fear of missing out, it absolutely does matter. But it gets beat every day of the week and twice on Sunday by FOMO, the fear of messing up. And yes, that's an acronym that we made up. It's actually the safe for work version. The not safe for work version would be FOFU, is what's really on their mind. I don't want to. You guys can figure out what that might mean.
Yeah.
But that's what we're after here. They're really concerned about messing up. You know, your 10% discount means nothing to me if my job's on the line, if this thing were to go wrong. And I've had decisions like this go wrong in the past, and I bring that baggage into the conversation, and we have to make sure that we're dealing with it. Now, the fears that they're typically worrying about most, because of course there's tons of drivers about things that make us individually more decisive or less decisive, just about our personalities in nature. And some of those we talk about some of those in the book. Those are worth understanding as we think about qualifying that opportunity, forecasting it. Can they ever make a decision or not? But there's not a lot we can do about changing it. In the context of a purchase, when they go to buy something, we find three biggest drivers that hang up buyers in these moments. First one on the left-hand side is about choice overload. So even after they decide that they want to purchase, they have to figure out what to purchase. And there's all these different options, all these different choices, these implementations and integrations and configurations and packages and contract length and all these things I have to go and decide. And for the buyer, they all look right. People in general, and buyers especially, are really bad at making trade-offs. They stink at making decisions about this one's better than that one and what proportion. And so they're really worried that they're going to make this decision and then immediately regret that decision, and it will feel like irreversible in nature. And so they'd rather just wait. So that's choice overload. Information overload in the middle is a pretty interesting one because, of course, we live in this world of information abundance, but it's actually that abundance itself that drives some of this paralysis for buyers because they feel like there's so much information out there that I can't excuse away the fact that I might not know enough to make this decision. Like, it's my job to make sure I am a fully informed purchaser on behalf of my company. It's almost like a fiduciary responsibility of mine, and I'm worried I haven't yet done enough homework. So these are the buyers that are just like, they almost feel like they have to memorize the user guide before they're willing to take that leap of faith. So it drives sellers crazy because they have all the information they need and they still feel like they're left in the dark. The right-hand side, the last one, is really about buyers worried that the outcomes that they're looking to attain still feel very uncertain. So this is the buyer who feels like, despite all the assurances you've given them, all the case studies they've seen, all the reference calls they've done, they'll be the one exception, and they're not going to get what they're paying for. You know, and if things go wrong, and of course all of us have been through implementations that do go wrong, my name's on the line, like my head's on the chopping block, nobody else's. And what's also interesting about expectations overload is very often this is about them and not us, meaning they feel like, look, we screw things up all the time. Have you seen this team? Like, we can't have nice things. We know this, right? And so that they blame themselves more so than they blame you. It's not like they're questioning the value, right? Or they're questioning the fact that your reference customer was lying to them, but rather they just feel like they're not able to attain those outcomes. So those are those three kind of big fears that buyers have. And for us as researchers, this was pretty interesting because none of these have anything to do with the status quo, right? You could be worried about any one of these three things and be fully committed to change, right? I could be fully committed to want the change and need the change and still not be sure which option to choose, and they all look right. And until I figure out which path to go down, let's wait it out. I could fully believe that I want to change and need to change and still be worried there's skeletons hidden in the closet that I don't yet know about, surprises around the corner that I need to know because I don't want to look like I have egg on my face if I make a decision now and something comes out later. I could fully believe I want to make that change and still feel like, you know what, we'll be the one exception. I'm not sure we can achieve what these outcomes are saying that we can. So the status quo makes no appearance, and that's really, really important because it's a profound insight into buyer psychology. We've been told for decades that sellers have one job and one job only, which is to beat the customer status quo. You know, find the need, sell the need. And if that doesn't work, orient them to the pain, remind them of the pain and sit on that pain. We now know for the highly indecisive buyer, that just doesn't work. Right. And the story I like to tell here, I think, is pretty illustrative of what's happening here. Is it was relayed to us by a CEO who was at like a trade show, a conference with all these booths set up, and he walked over at one point and told us a story about a customer that just walked up to their booth and relaying to us what had just happened. This customer had been in their pipeline for about 6 months, and they had been forecasting it to come in for almost 3. And so they felt like everything was going well, and then all of a sudden they could get the person on the phone. He started asking questions that they had put to bed months ago over email, and then they couldn't even get the response to the email. And then the person shows up at their booth and asks for a demo. And the sales team's like, this person definitely doesn't need another demo. They've been with us for 6 months. They've had plenty of demos. Hey, CEO, can you go talk to this person? So he goes and talks to the customer. He says, look, I'm so glad to hear that things seem to be going pretty well. Glad to hear we have some pretty good alignment here. Love to hear some feedback about the process. And the buyer says, look, we love you guys. Terrific. And we're excited to be working with you. I just think if we can get another demo for the people in the buying committee, that ought to be the next best step. And the CEO said, sure, of course, happy to set that up. It seems like we've had a couple of different interactions. If you can help me understand where's the gap, so we can make sure we tee you up for success. And the guy said, look, we just have different priorities we need to weigh. I said, sure, that's understandable. Tell me about your priorities. And he started listing them off, and CEO kind of called time out and said, look, I get that you have to weigh different priorities, but we're number 1 or 2 in market in each one of those 5 or 6. So again, what's going on? And the buyer said, okay, look, here's the thing. Last year, we bought a solution from one of your competitors, and they overpromised on a couple of key capabilities. And those are gaps that I still have. And that's why I'm excited to buy from you, because I do actually have to fill those gaps. And I feel like you guys are going to, but I don't think I can go make a business case to my CFO, because I'm the one who made a business case last time. And I'm going to look like an idiot for having said that this last thing was going to solve it, and now yours will too. So I just need a little bit more cover. And that's kind of FOMO on display, right? We need to be careful about that buyer absolutely wanted to purchase, absolutely felt like he needed to purchase, and throwing more pain on that, throwing more fear on top of the fear he already had about messing up isn't going to do the trick. And that's why things end up backfiring. So we know we need this second playbook. It's really about overcoming indecision, and it can start as early as the first conversation. It's not just a late stage thing. But of course, we need both. We have to beat the status quo. We have to overcome indifference, and we have to make sure that we are addressing indecision. And those playbooks are quite different. So the status quo playbook is very much about dialing up the fear of what happens if you don't purchase, right? What's the pain of inaction? The indecision, though, is quite different. It's about dialing down the fear of the purchase itself. That's what the buyer is really worried about.
Yeah. Hey, Ted, we've got a couple questions that I think
Sure.
are timely. As you go through the playbooks, the big question, and Jeff is asking, do the sources of seniority matter here? Is indecision more prevalent in a junior person or more prevalent in a senior person, or it just doesn't matter?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the answer really is it doesn't matter. We didn't find any correlation between role in purchase or seniority in these situations, and it's a little confounding, I think, for a lot of sellers, because most buyers, especially very senior buyers, would consider themselves to be pretty rational and very decisive people. I mean, after all, that's how I got this job, right? I make decisions all day long. But indecision is a very human problem that affects all of us in very similar ways. So we didn't find any real correlation between seniority or role in purchase.
Okay, and then there's one more from John saying, what if the buyer is confident in wanting to move forward, yet the CFO increasingly controls the purse strings? And John, I'm just going to take a liberty here. Is a broader decision committee a contributor to FOMO?
Just more people involved in the purchase. It's a pretty
Yeah.
common question we get. I think the easiest way to think about this is, yeah, sure, if there's more than one person or several people in the buying committee that are indecisive, it certainly amplifies otherwise lower levels of indecision. The advice I always give sales teams is the first best thing, of course, is to make sure that at minimum you understand the level of indecision for your advocate, for your champion, for your mobilizer, whoever that person might be. Because if they're the ones who are most indecisive, that's going to be a tough crawl. But yeah, certainly buying committee indecision in general and the conditions of chaotic decision making and dysfunctional decision making certainly can be a big sign that there's something amiss in terms of how they evaluate alternatives, how they consume information, and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you.
Let me just hit the JOLT playbook real quick. I know I'm probably a little bit over time. JOLT is an acronym, so it represents the 4 key behaviors of what the high-performing sellers are doing differently than their peers. Of course, it also has double meaning. You're jolting customers into action and past their indecision. J is about judging the level of indecision and understanding the size and depth and breadth. And I do that both because I want to understand the quality of that opportunity. Should I keep pursuing this? Should I deprioritize it because maybe they can never make a decision? But also in doing so, I'll learn a little bit about the type of indecision that they're most gripped by. Are they more worried about the options, the information, or the outcomes? And doing that then helps me understand the play I might need to run. So the O, for example, offer your recommendation is particularly useful for that buyer who's worried about, I'm going to make the wrong choice. There's so many choices. Each one represents a new way that I can mess up, and I don't want to make this irreversible decision. So a firm and personal recommendation is very powerful there. Limit the exploration is about helping that buyer who's kind of into analysis paralysis mode and doing excessive levels of exploration in those moments. And high performers are able to limit that to reasonable levels. They earn back a little bit of trust in the process and demonstrate themselves as experts. So the buyer doesn't feel like they have to become an expert themselves as they go through the process. And then finally, taking risk off the table is particularly useful for that buyer who's worried about outcomes still remaining uncertain. So high performers are setting really clear, proper expectations about the outcomes that are practical and achievable. And then when necessary, they're de-risking it through safety nets and other ways to kind of provide downside protection for those buyers. So the 4 key behaviors, and the payoff, of course, is pretty considerable. So as we look at different levels of indecision, low, moderate, and high, and then you look at the lighter shaded blue bars, that's the average performer win rate. In low indecision moments, everyone's quite good, 39% win rate. High performers, of course, JOLT sellers are quite even better, 70%. They're crushing it there. The problem is there's not enough buyers there. What we found is that 87% of buyers are in the middle or on the right of the slide. 87% of opportunities have either moderate or high levels of indecision. So you can see as you get to the right side of the page, core performers really struggle in those moderate indecision and really, really struggle in the high indecision moments. JOLT sellers are doing quite well in that moderate, double the performance, and even above average in that high level of indecision. And so we can again unpack more about kind of what's happening here, what those behaviors are. But that's kind of the core JOLT story, and happy to kind of pull up for any more questions or discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Couple thoughts, and then we have a bunch of, and maybe Rob, you can filter through. I think we've handled a lot of the questions that have come in, but we can open it up to more. We've got a lot of marketers here as well. So I think this, in the spirit of sales and marketing together, Sammy's, kind of view of the world, a couple thoughts that come to me as a marketing leader. One is marketing also needs a different playbook, right? For when to dial up fear and when to dial down fear, and to work hand in glove with the sales organization, because maybe there's different kinds of customer stories. Maybe there's different kinds of video testimonials that are part of that playbook. So thinking about, I've always built like a content ecosystem for different stages of the selling cycle, but now keeping in mind, when you reach that sort of FOMO to FOMO, chasm, and thinking about the content. And also, I guess this is part of the question part of it. Similarly, are there things marketing can do in those cold feet moments, right? When we detect those cold feet moments, like we were talking about, how can marketing equip sales to overcome them? One of the comments in the chat was that brand, of course, is important because that leads to trust. Brand is something you need to do over time, and that hopefully will help you on this whole trajectory. But what can marketers do in the moment when they see those cold feet moments?
Yeah, I'd agree. So yeah, the trusted brand, nobody ever got fired from buying from IBM. I suppose that can help in those situations. Keep in mind though, this isn't so much about them feeling like they're excited about moving forward. It's more about the consequences of something having gone wrong. And even big brands aren't immune to this, right? So like I was with a tech company the other day, and they were saying, look, we are legitimately the easiest in market to implement. And I said, that's probably true. But even if that's true, that's on a relative basis because everyone's been through implementations and they're never really easy, right? And so it's all on a relative scale, even if you're the best, most trusted brand. But you're right, it's also kind of a long-term play. I think there's ways for marketing and sales enablement and broadly the community of people helping the sales organization to think through, positioning and think through how they're helping handle those sort of, implementation and change related objections that buyers either have implicitly or explicitly. There's a skill in the book we talk about called pre-buttals, which on the surface sounds kind of insane because this is a seller rebutting an objection that hasn't yet been raised. But they're thinking through, what is the fear? What's the question behind the question? What's the real root fear that this buyer has about messing up? And if I can equip my team to think through kind of like almost co-occurrence, when buyers worry about this, they often also worry about that. What are the things that kind of co-occur together? And if you can imagine, little message vignettes or ways that you can help with positioning there, I think that would help sellers go a long way in those moments.
Yeah, great point. We do have 2 requests for giving us an example of the JOLT steps in action. If you can maybe walk us through an example.
Yeah. So the most recent one that I like a lot is, so if you think about like oversimplifying the recommendation, I like to think about this as if you were selling to your best friend, what would you tell them to go and do? Right. And it is an oversimplified version of it because we're often not selling to our best friends, but often the seller knows in their gut, what's the features that are ready for prime time and what aren't. What are the things that buyers are always going to be happy with and never regret? What's the thing that, is the solid state battery with hardly any moving parts versus the thing that has tons of variability with lots of dependencies and lots of variance in the experience. So I think about that first. And in that respect, then you're trying to guide that customer towards what you might consider to be kind of a child-proof version of your product, right? The version of it that you can't possibly mess up, even if you tried. It's got rubber corners and everything. And one recent example I liked was this company that they sell to CFOs. They sort of sell an accounting solution, and one of the parts of the one feature of their product amongst dozens and dozens of features is that it would send out automated emails to vendors and contractors as a way to get pieces of information in the process. And although that was considered to be a pretty valuable thing for the buyer, it was in their minds one of the riskiest aspects of making the decision. Part of it was because of control. Like I don't have as much control over the fact that these emails are just going out without me being able to see them. What is the content of these things? Are people going to get upset? Is there blowback I'm going to get because of this? And so what they realized was one thing I can do pretty easily is just tell the buyer, hey, don't turn that feature on for 6 months. Right. And what's interesting is it actually didn't change the price of the product at all. Same price, same product. It actually did make implementation easier because they don't have to load into the system contact information and all this other pieces. But for the buyer, it felt like a much safer potential solution that still checked all their boxes with respect to value. So just one small example of a situation where you're kind of thinking through the implications from the buyer's perspective of where might things mess up and how can I make them feel more comfortable in the process, knowing that this buyer absolutely does want to buy, need to buy. So I'm actually helping them do what they've already said they're looking to do.
So Ted, there seems to be a little bit of a theme.
Go ahead, Rob. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm looking at, I think you've hit a nerve with, I think the implementation side, and both Kaylee and William are asking questions. They're looking at it from the marketer perspective. What do we need to do as marketers to help alleviate the fears? Because it sounds as if we're putting the burden of the experience or the implementation on the salespeople. So the question for you is, what do marketers need to consider to somehow help the sales team with Indecision, especially around implementation?
Yeah, and I wouldn't anchor too much on implementation itself. I mean, I think onboarding, implementation, all the things that there's a difference between them wondering in general about change being painful and them worrying about we're going to mess this up and I'm going to have a personal consequence from it. And I think as marketers, I would think about a couple of things. one, B2B buyers, it's pretty clear from our research, B2B buyers are a lot more emotional than we might have otherwise thought. So what does that mean? That means, running back to ROI models and running back to the rational, case for change in those situations isn't probably the best thing to do in that moment. Um, you have to, of course, remind them of value, and you have to overcome that hurdle of indifference. But there's a second aspect to this, and it's far more personal in nature. So think about their job, think about their role, think about the consequences that they would have personally if this thing were to go wrong. What might they lose? What face might they lose internally? What things might they be exposed to in general, and how can we help them, in those moments? Indecision, for a buyer, can often feel like a pretty lonely thing. They might not even fully realize that this is something that's affecting them. So the more that the organization can do to make it feel like you're not alone, that let other companies like you at this juncture often deal with these things and wonder about these things, and it's natural for you too, because going down this path actually does have a very different implementation path than the other one. So let's help them think through the consequence and be very clear about the implications of going down this path versus that path.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Pam, I think I inadvertently talked over you.
Yeah, no worries. I just wanted to make sure I wanted to loop back to both Jeff and Laura, who asked for the examples of the JOLT. Just want to make sure we answered your question. And then also, Charles, you were looking for some clarification on the L phase. So I just want to make sure that what Ted covered answered your question. So feel free to pipe up if not.
Yeah, I could, if it'd be helpful, I can go a little deeper on each one of the letters, if that's what they're asking.
Yeah.
Well, let's take the L. I know there was a
Mhm.
question about the L. Maybe let's, okay, Jeff is good, so that's great. But maybe let's just do a slightly deeper dive on the L.
Sure. Yeah. So in these situations, look, we can't just ask the buyer to stop asking questions. There's going to be some amount of exploration that's natural and reasonable and expected, in those situations. What we're trying to avoid is excessive levels of exploration. And what that really is fear spreading for the buyer, right? They're worried that there are all sorts of unknowns that they haven't yet fully understood. Because who among us has not been oversold in the past or felt like they've been overpromised in the past, like many of us, perhaps all of us. And so they're kind of terrified that they are left in the dark. Again, not a very rational thing, but it feels like for this buyer, despite all the information you're giving me, I must still not have enough. Like other people must have more than me. And the seller's kind of scratching their head thinking like, there's literally nothing else I can send you. I've sent you everything I possibly can. But it's this buyer just feeling like I still need to make sure I know more. Now, a big part of this is them feeling like, you know what, the sellers in general don't have my best interest in mind. They're incentivized to like hide the bad features and to not let me talk to the customers who are upset. And it's not that realistic for me to think that 1000% of your customers are super happy. There's got to be somebody who has had a poor experience. And until I figure out what might be driving some of that, I'm less comfortable in that situation. They believe that sellers, again, have an incentive to take roadmap items that aren't quite ready for prime time and make them features of the demo, to oversell certain features or to hide in the closet all the bad news. And so they feel like it's my job to go and find that information. So a big part of the big first part of limiting the exploration is the seller earning back a little bit of that trust. And to be clear, it's not always the seller's fault that the buyer distrusts them. It's built up over time. It's baggage they bring into it. But nonetheless, it's the seller's job to earn back a little bit of that trust. One of the first best things we talk about doing to be able to do that is, and it actually speaks to a little bit to the interconnectivity between the recommendation, the O, and the L, which is that part of making that recommendation isn't just about what you are telling them to do, but also telling them what not to do. So taking some options off the table, and especially for an incentive-based rep to tell a buyer, you know what, I don't think this is quite right for you, or maybe this is a year two thing here. This is a nice to have, not a need to have. I don't think you should quite do this quite yet. That's a trust building exercise for that seller in the moment. Recognizing a competitor has a strength in certain cases can be another one. Admitting when you don't know the answer. There's a series of things the seller can do to earn back a little bit of trust. But the role they play in that process matters quite a bit too. part of the study was involving trying to understand the dynamics of a conversation and interaction. So in what respect is the seller conducting that interaction in a way that builds confidence and comfort for that buyer? How are they dealing with call partners in the process? So many of us have come to rely on sales engineers and solutions engineers and other people who are going to surround the sales process as a way to demonstrate this expertise and to show this terrific technical solution, whether it's a technology thing or a hard science thing or whatever it might be. There's all these layers of people that kind of come into the process, and I think what's happened over time is that the seller has started to abdicate their role in the process. They defer to those experts. They set up the conversation and then they let them take it away and recede into the background for the next 55 minutes. And for the buyer in that moment, what that feels like is, well, the only reason you're here is to have set up the conversation. You're just kind of a glorified admin in this moment. I think I need to make sure I'm going to either go to that other expert, or I still feel like I have to be the expert because I'm not dealing with somebody who is. And it's tough for the seller in that moment because you might not be the deepest expert in that moment, but you have to find your source of expertise and you have to conduct that interaction in a way that demonstrates that you at least know where this train's going, right? You've been down this path before. You understand where those blind alleys might be. And that in doing so, you're going to at least position yourself as somebody who's doing some of that homework for and with that buyer along the way. And there's some other skills I think that are important in those moments too, but that's kind of the first best place for a seller to start.
Right. We've got a question here, which I think is an interesting one. From a services only perspective, how do you use JOLT to overcome new technologies like AI that is causing customers to be very indecisive?
Great question.
Yeah, it's interesting. So AI is this very interesting thing that is driving, I think, a lot of curiosity amongst buyers, and it's a double-edged sword because people are fully willing to take the demo and fully willing to knock on the door and fully willing to have endless amounts of exploration and probably very willing to ask for free trials and free POCs and what have you. I don't know necessarily that hesitation there is always due to indecision. I think there's probably some element of that where they're wondering about, there's still core value questions they're probably wondering about. Am I going to waste my money on this? Are people really going to use this? Those are related but different than, this is a definite yes for us. It's more about when we say yes, what mess ups might occur and how's that going to have consequences for me personally or for my team more broadly. But I do think in general, this is true about AI and probably for a lot of different services. I think the question was both about services and AI. Is that anytime there's something with a high degree of variability in the outcome, with a lot of unknowns, a lot of dependencies, that's always going to raise, I think, FOMO, because it's hard to account for it. Your imagination can run wild about all the bad things that could occur. It's harder to predict with certainty what's going to go down. And I think especially with going back to AI, huge amounts of eyeballs on those types of purchases. The board is probably aware of the types of things we're doing there. And so therefore the consequence of a bad decision rises as well. So you can see how that might contribute to indecision as well. Sometimes these things are areas of gray and not black and white, right? So something like AI, I can imagine having both indifference problems and indecision problems at the same time, in different proportion depending on the situation.
Yep, absolutely. So, Ted, we've got a couple of asks just to run through the JOLT again. If you maybe want to bring up that one slide, if your deck is still handy, and then we're running really tight on time. I knew this would be a robust conversation. Rob has a kind of a closing question after we satisfy everybody's interest in this one more time.
Sure. I'll talk fast. I've already done the L. So
yep.
So judge level of indecision. Here we have to understand the depth and breadth of it, both because we need to think about qualifying on that. So most sellers will qualify on traditional factors like, and can this person ever buy? Is their budget, is the timing right, is authority right? Or traditional BANT criteria, if you will. And that's important, of course. We have to do that to understand whether this person can buy. But the second dimension that JOLT sellers look at opportunities on is, can they ever make a decision? Can they decide? And if not, even if they're a great fit on paper, I might look to deprioritize this if I can, and at minimum, forecast it in a way that sets expectations about how quickly this can come in. The skill that we found that sellers do here in these situations, we call them pings, and they're looking for echoes back from buyers, I should say. It's like a sonar. So they're, one of the tricky parts about indecision is often underneath the surface outside of our view, and the buyer doesn't just come out and say, I'm terrible at making decisions. So the analogy is the sonar, where we're pinging underneath the surface of the water, trying to understand the nature of it. How big is it? How wide is it? How fast is it moving? And so the pings are essentially kind of like emotionally charged statements. You're trying to articulate the fear that you think that buyer might be experiencing at that moment and create this space to have this conversation. So that's judging level of indecision. Offer your recommendation. So here again, the main reason we look to make that recommendation is to help that buyer who stinks at making trade-offs, right? They're not great at making, trying to understand in what proportion or something better. They all look right. So a firm and personal recommendation is really important, partly because what you're doing is you're signaling, I'm willing to shift some of the blame from the buyer to me as the seller. We're going to share in this choice. I think part of the problem here often with these choices that marketers, love choice and love options, and for good reason. It's very attractive. It does its job by bringing people into the storefront, if you will. But when it comes to making decisions, it can paralyze those buyers. And what sellers find is that if you're looking at everything, you're less likely to choose anything, right? Because we've got to find a way to constrain that choice set and at some point stop asking and tell them what we think they should do. Taking risks off the table is for that buyer where outcomes feel uncertain, expectations feel really overloaded. Expectation setting is a pretty common thing that we think about doing. It's the most powerful skill in the whole predictive model that we built. Too often we do that too late. We wait till the buyer sets their own expectations about what they think they should do. And then if the buyer starts to get their eyes too big for their stomach, or they get a little over the tips of their skis, then we look to ratchet those expectations back. And so there's a big skill around making sure we're grounding them in practical, believable, achievable outcomes from the beginning. And then also offer safety nets in certain situations where it feels like those are necessary. Those could be informal in nature, thinking about positioning a mutual value plan, for example, as a way to help the buyer understand what's going to happen at day 1, day 60, day 90, and so forth, and how we're going to surround you with support. Sometimes they need to be a little more formal and might even require a little bit of permission. Start small, add professional services, or contractually walking the walk with you, perhaps some back out clauses in certain situations. Not every situation is going to call for that or will be permissioned for that, but the basic teaching point there is do something, have a plan. Don't just hope and pray that it's going to go away. With a highly indecisive buyer, more likely to get stuck.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I just remind everybody to buy the book and read it, because it has the deepest dive into the JOLT. So, Rob, I'll let you wrap it up, and then I'll come back. I've got a couple of closing remarks for us.
Yes, thank you, Pam, and thanks, Ted. We've got probably more questions that we can cover. So a couple things, Ted. I want to ask one question, then we'll do the wrap up. So you guys did a lot of research, and there's probably a lot of research, and we're all limited by our publishers about what we can include in the book. And if there was something in retrospect that you left off the table with JOLT, what would it be? And what will go into version 2 of the book, or what will go into the next book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd be tempted to say we didn't leave anything on the cutting room floor. No, I'm kidding. So it's actually there are some skills, like pings, for example, is not a skill that's in the book. The research did continue on after we hit send to it, partly as we start to observe how do you get better at these skills. It's one thing to know conceptually what these things are. It's another thing to think through, like, how do I know if I'm making improvement on this front? So pings is one example of what might have been in a sequel or the next chapter, if you will, with respect to judge and level of indecision. And our curriculum has a number of those types of examples. What's a framework I can use for recommendations? What's a framework I can use for expectation setting, and whatnot? I do think back to the point I made earlier about positioning, more and more we have clients who are thinking about, is there a second story to our positioning? It's not just about value, but about addressing this fear of messing up. It's not something we thought we focused on behaviors and skills primarily in the book because that was the focus of the study. But there is sort of a second layer of this that gets to positioning and even sales process to another extent, about helping people understand the rhythms of that decision making, if you will.
Excellent. Excellent, Ted. Thank you. Any closing thoughts? And then we're going to hand it over to Pam. Ted, anything that you think we walk away, and what should people do with the next hour?
Yeah, well, go buy the book. JOLTEffect.com's got a lot of other information, some free tools on there that you can download. But feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to answer any of the questions. And yeah, appreciate you guys having me.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thank you,
Thanks,
Ted, so much for joining us. And, another one of our collaborative, insightful SAMI sessions where we know we're going to be like putting these things into practice right away. So, Ted, thank you so much for doing that. This recording, as Rob said, will be available soon in the Meetup group. You'll get an announcement about that. We are building out the rest of our spring 2024 sessions. We've got a couple of things to mention right now. For those of us in the Boston area, on Thursday evening, February 29th, we will have a live meetup in conjunction with our friends at Any Excuse CMO. We're going to be doing that at the Waltham Weston. There'll be an announcement in the meetup group later today, and I hope to see some of you there. And then we are working on a session. We're not ready to announce it yet, but we will soon. In March, we're going to sit down with somebody who had the intriguing title, I thought, of Chief Pipeline Officer. And he's going to explain what that job is and the benefits and challenges of this emerging role and why he probably would never want to have that job again. So I think that's going to be an interesting one. So as always, the meetup group is where we have all the details of the sessions as they get firmed up. Please be sure to check your settings in Meetup to make sure that you get the announcements. For those of you who are first timers, good news, you're going to get all those announcements going forward now that you're part of the group. And as always, if there are topics or speakers you'd like to hear from, please let us know. Rob, myself, Molly, Dave, John, or Ann. And we're definitely going to be continuing the conversation on AI as well this spring. So Ted, once again, thank you so much for being here. Everybody, thanks for joining. I wish you the best for your Thursday. We'll see you next time.